Great. Thank you so much, Rusty. It's great to see everyone here. Let me just do a little bit of screen rearrangement on this size. So I'm Jennifer Nutefall. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at the University of Northern Colorado, and I started during the Superfund time, July 1st of 2020. So this is us talking about what we did during the pandemic. So Jayne.
Yeah, hi, everyone. My name is Jayne Blodgett. I'm the Associate Dean at UNC, and I've been here for about 6 years. So I went through some strategic planning, not in the pandemic, and then during the pandemic.
So usually I know the chats are pretty active during these sessions. So we have a few questions that we've embedded throughout, but please feel free to ask questions at any time. And what we can't get to during the more formal presentation, we'll save an answer towards the end. So which brings us to our first question. Because there are so many of you registered and interested for today, we just wanted to take a moment and hear what you are hoping to learn from this session. So if you can take a minute and put a few thoughts in the chat, that will allow us to make sure that our goals and objectives hopefully match up for today, but also if there's anything in particular that we can try to address that as we go along. Oh, exhaustion, aren't we all? All right, so while you guys are typing out some of those, what we're hoping to do today is talk about how we created our mission, vision, and value statements that serve as both representational and aspirational, how we incorporated feedback virtually throughout the process, and then how working on this during the pandemic allowed us to focus on the future and step back from the many day-to-day issues that we were facing at that time. And we have some reflections at the end on what worked, what didn't, and what we might do differently, but also how some of this, our practices could be used even during non-pandemic times, I'll just say. Let's just hope that happens. All right, so Jayne.
So for our agenda today, we'll give you some background and overview. Jennifer's going to talk about the theories that she utilized to help us move through some of this process. And then we'll spend a lot of time talking about how we actually managed to craft new mission, vision, and value statements. We actually didn't have We had a mission statement, but we didn't have a vision or value statements. And so that was a new process for a lot of folks in the libraries. Once we created those, we were able to move on to creating our strategic plan. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with some reflections as to what we learned about creating all of these things during a pandemic. And then also one of the things Jennifer's going to talk about is how we're actually implementing that as we move forward now. I am not saying post-pandemic because I just ordered new masks today. So I'm going to say continuing in a more hybrid model.
So diplomatic, Jayne. So I wanted to just put this planning framework up here. So some of you may be familiar with John Cotter's book on leading change and the 8-stage model. I find it very useful. It's a super quick read in terms of the book, but I like the way that he's laid the stages out, in part because culture change is always what comes last. So you really can't get there until you do all that other work. And most of the time, leaders at various levels always talk about culture change first, but there's this realization of what we need to build that base. So what we've articulated and really will be touching on is the first 4 stages today. And then I would say now that we've gotten about 6 to 8 months into implementation, we're starting to get to some of the other stages, but that is a whole separate presentation. So the first stage in Cotter's model is creating a sense of urgency. And I feel like what is more urgent than a pandemic a financial emergency at a university and the arrival of a new dean, replacing someone who's been here long term. So that's what I came into when I started here July 1st of 2020. We also have a newish president, a new university strategic plan, and then turnover among university leadership, and that's among the deans, vice presidents, and others. And so the timing was really right for the library to start looking at its own strategic planning process. So the way that I think of it and approach it is that it's looking 3 or more years into the future. Most of my plans are 3 years because I find that that 5-year window is just a little bit too long in terms of other changes that might occur. Helping to provide that path to guide how we prioritize and focus, I would say both people and monetary resources. And then we're the University of Northern Colorado Bears, so giving our Bear community an investment in the future of the libraries. So the second stage in Cotter's model is building a guiding coalition. And so for us, that was putting together our strategic planning task force. And I've done this a couple of times now at 2 institutions. And so the way that I approach putting together the task force is really thinking about what I'm looking for in those individuals that I'm asking to serve. So it's people with a broad perspective on the libraries, individuals with both long and short-term lengths of tenure at the institution, representation from both librarians and staff, and individuals who can think creatively or strategically. And it was also important not to have a lot of department heads represented so that it really was inclusive of everyone in the libraries. I've also found that having an outside facilitator is helpful because it provides both a neutral party to lead that process and then allows me to be a full participant in it. So I asked our assistant director of human resources to be our facilitator, and she agreed. She's actually on the webinar today, so thank you, Sarah. And then for our faculty and student representative, we got a recommendation from our student senate and had really great student participate. And then subject librarians provided recommendations for the faculty member. So what we did was our mission, vision, values, just as representatives of the libraries, and then added the faculty and student representative for our strategic plan. So the final part I want to talk about here is just the communication aspect of it. And it's really important to think about this early on in the process and not save it until later. And I think especially more so with the situation that we were in, because there were no in-person meetings or no ways to bump into people in the hallway. So this is an example of how we structured our communication plan. So we had a whole list of who are the different audiences that we're trying to reach. What sort of messages do we want to send them? How frequently should that be going out? What method are we using that? Is that in person? Which again, didn't really happen, but what sort of format, email, videos, other sorts of things, who's responsible for doing that? And then once we started moving forward, when that happened, and then any notes on feedback or other responses or questions that we received. So just some other groups that we articulated outside of the libraries and the provost were the deans, faculty senate, grad council, undergraduate council, student senate, and then also our Friends of the Libraries group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jayne to get in a few more specifics on what we did. Jayne, you're muted.
So as I mentioned before, we focused on creating a new mission statement and then also generating a vision statement. From those, we also created values. We're not going to talk about those as much during this meeting. We're going to just focus on how our mission and vision statements drove some of our strategic planning. And it was really important for us that we were very clear with everyone as to what the difference between the mission statement was and what the vision statement was, because there can be a lot of confusion. You might be looking at this and saying, that's not how I think of it. And that's all fine. I think you need to figure out what's going to work best for your library. But for us, we chose to say that our mission statement is really focused on why do we exist? And our vision statement was thinking out into the future of where are we going and why are we wanting to do that? So there were a couple of videos that are associated with this that once we're done and you get the PDF of the presentation, you'll be able to go out and look. They're pretty short. They're like 2 to 3 minutes long. For me, one of the things I loved about the mission statement examples is thinking about what to put on a t-shirt. Not that I would necessarily always wear the t-shirt, but I like that idea of being really succinct as to what it is that we are doing. And then our vision statement, I think was in some ways a little more challenging for us to come up with because I don't want to say that we weren't thinking about the future. I think we were, but we weren't really always thinking about it in a way that was going to be written down and succinct. And I think we had also some issues, the audaciousness of it. I think a lot of us were trepidatious about how audacious should we be knowing that we were living in a pandemic and that we were having budget issues on campus. So how do you be audacious but also realistic? So our process that we did was we spent, I guess, probably about 2 months or so, maybe 3, figuring out our mission statement and vision statement. We looked at questions like, what kinds of work do we do? How could we, describe the library in a few words? And we ended up breaking into small groups. So there were 4 groups of, I think, 2 people each. And then they brainstormed a mission statement, and then we put those 4 together, and then we talked about them, and then we turned them into 2 statements, and then there was some more wordsmithing, and we sort of did the same process with the vision statement. But in the terms of the vision statement, it was thinking about, and I found this very helpful, and I think other people did once again, to think about something very concrete, like if we were going to win an award in 5 years, what would that be for? And then we could take that concrete example and sort of make it a little more abstract so that it fit better as to what a vision statement should be. This is more just an example so you could kind of see, especially later if you're thinking about how much time should we put into these sorts of things. So this is a sample from one of our agendas of how we actually did this. So the pairs had met outside of our normal meeting time to come up with their draft, shared it out so everybody had a chance to review it. So we went around the room, virtual room, and talked a little bit about it. Then we had large group discussions, and then we broke into different groups than our pairs to do some more discussion, lots of wordsmithing, lots of meetings. But we finally came up with what we think were good draft mission and vision statements.
But before you show you what we actually finally settled on, a little bit then about how we got feedback. So imagine you spend 2 months doing all of this work as a task force. You're obviously very invested in it, but it's important to get feedback from everybody. Does that make sense to them? So our all hands meeting is our monthly all staff meeting. And so during the pandemic, we are a Microsoft campus, so we did those via Teams. So members of the task force did a virtual presentation during one of our all hands meetings, a brief overview of the process, and then the draft statement, and then this series of questions that we asked. And we didn't ask for feedback right then and there. Instead, we held virtual open forums. We offered 2 of those, so different days and times to meet different schedules. And then we also had a Qualtrics survey open that asked those exact same questions. And so this really provided a variety of opportunities for people to give feedback on those. And so then this is just a quick sample of some of the feedback that we ended up receiving. So, people pick up on certain words or phrases and want some clarification around that. And so after we had these open forums, we got the survey results, the task force got back together, discussed the major themes that we saw, and we just made slight changes in some of the statements, especially the vision needed a bit more reworking based on what we heard from individuals. And then there were also some larger comments about like, well, what does this look like in practice? And that's where really then the strategic plan, comes in. So this is really setting the stage for that more concrete action that people were looking for from these statements. So here's what we came up with for our mission and vision. And again, mission is the why do we exist? We're partnering with our bear community through diverse collections, innovative services, and welcoming spaces to promote curiosity, learning, teaching, and engage global citizenship. I might proudly wear that on a t-shirt around my building. We did joke about getting the strategic planning task force t-shirts that say that. And then as our vision, you'll notice once again that it is very short and concise. And in this case, we specifically focused on students. So UNC has a high population of first-gen students. We're on the path to becoming an HSI. And the framework for our strategic plan is students first. So while we got some feedback about why we weren't mentioning faculty or the larger community in our vision statement, what we kept coming back to is what is our tie and link with the university. And that really was that transformational aspect for students for us. Our values are much longer and we can point you to the website for that. Jane, maybe if I could ask you real quick to maybe throw in a link to our mission, vision, values online. So we want to take a brief pause before we move on to our strategic planning process and see what questions you have about what we did in this first segment. And then if you've helped create mission, vision, and value statements, were there certain things that worked or didn't work when you went through that process? Just gonna let people hang out for a second. Thank you, Jane. All right, not seeing anything in the chat right now. We will keep an eye on that. Oh, here we go. So Jane mentioned, and Jane, just confirm if this is right or not, that the library previously did have a mission statement, but not vision, correct?
Yes.
So we actually decided not to use that as a starting point. And really, we wanted to start from scratch. I think for a couple of reasons, which is, I think if you start from something existing, especially if it was under maybe a previous administration, I think that some ways that might limit your thinking about how we just update or modify this instead of taking a whole new approach in terms of what those mission and visions might be now. And then, yeah, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, Jennifer and I think
Also have we have a shared view of how we want the libraries to work and the levels of agency that we want to see from staff and faculty. And so I think it was also really important to indicate that we were trying to build on what we had been doing very well in the past, but also take new approaches to the work that we were doing. And so creating a new mission statement, I think, helped people maybe see that we were trying to build something different.
Yeah. And I'll just say for those of you that are not on Microsoft campuses, but my previous institution was a Google Apps. Teams really allows to function a little bit differently, but both as a virtual platform, but also for file sharing. So we had a whole site set up for this task force where we posted agendas and minutes and draft presentations and drafts of the other work that we were doing. And so that was just a space for us to do our work. So it was nice in keeping that organized. So a similar kind of thing to a Google Drive. So Jayne, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk then about strategic planning.
Yeah, and just as a
Reminder to you, this is the point where we actually brought in our faculty and student partners. So they started coming to our biweekly meetings, which was really very helpful. So once we had our mission and vision, we could talk about, how we wanted to see that reflected in our work and how it would align with our mission, vision, and values. So we had some brainstorming activity questions, thinking about what activities should be a part of our plan. We had a lot of conversation about how does it reflect the work we're already doing? Does it reflect the work we want to be doing? How do we make sure we keep doing the things we need to be doing and recognizing the value of those, but do they actually need to be in the strategic plan? And so the activity that came around that was actually using a virtual whiteboard to post our ideas, because we were still under restrictions as to how many people could be in our offices. We were still meeting virtually. So we had to use the tools that were available to us. So since, as Jennifer said, we were a Microsoft campus, Teams has a whiteboard feature. So we did some priorities brainstorming. And I actually was out this day. I was at an ALA council meeting. So Jennifer is going to talk about what that process was like.
Right. And so again, Sarah Chase, our facilitator, is here today and can also testify. This was chaos. What you're seeing is the end result, which is organized chaos. So Teams has a whiteboard feature. Sarah and I looked at a couple other options online, but it seemed best to go with what was already integrated in the software and technology that we had. This was the one activity I really wish where we could have been in person. So just imagine a virtual space and Post-its popping up all over the place. So some were overwriting other ones, people trying to move stuff around, different sizes, a little bit hard to read. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. So what we were able to do though after this is I took some time to just do some broad organization of themes that we saw. And then one of the task force members actually very nicely took it upon themselves to do some transcription. So she, typed all of this into a document, which made it much easier for everybody else to read, especially for Jayne, since she wasn't able to be at this meeting. So then what we used this for was to break into smaller groups, usually around 3 to 4 people. Around those top sort of reddish ones are like the broad priorities that we had started to think about. So we had groups formed around those to look over what people had input here and start thinking about what potential next steps should be. So those groups ask themselves things like, is this a standalone priority? Does this deserve to have that like highest level in a plan? Is it operational or strategic? And that is such an important question to really ask as you're doing this, because there were many things that people put in that was more of an operational, like someone had a question or put something in around interlibrary loan. Like that is a very specific small subset of something. And so we asked, like, is there something broader that we are trying to do with that? Or is that just something that we maybe pass on to that group or acknowledge and move on? So our initial set of 5 priorities were broadly around collections, community partnerships, teaching and outreach, libraries, personnel and development, and learning spaces. And so once those groups then came back to share their initial thoughts, We saw that there was some overlap. There's multiple things that could have gone, in many different priorities. And so we did combine two of them. We combined the community partnerships and the teaching and outreach. So Jane, I think I get to punch it over to you again.
Yes, so our feedback
for the strategic priorities and objectives was similar to what we did with the mission, vision, values, but we did also add in open forums for students and faculty staff across campus. I will say the open forums outside of the libraries, did not have great attendance, but we also sent out a Qualtrics survey, and that actually got us some really good feedback. So we had these 5 specific questions. I think maybe number 2, we did not ask of the students and the faculty and staff not in the libraries, so that because that would have been a little odd for them. But it was really important for us to get feedback once again from a broad audience, so not just those in the libraries, but also from our partners across campus. And it also, of course, gives them a chance to ask questions like, why'd you cancel that database? And then we can answer that. So some of the feedback that we got were things like how important it is for us to have electronic resources for students. So that may be an area for us to focus on for collection development, talking about additional programming with our community, both because we have a large number of Latinx students on campus, but Greeley is also around 30 to 40% Latinx population, and they have a lot of information and a lot of great community projects that we would love to be partners with. Keeping up projects like Scholar Spotlight, which you can probably all guess what that is about from the name. And then also making sure that we include students in our employee processes, so that we're not just thinking about how to recognize or make our workplace more inclusive for our full-time faculty and staff, but also for the 80 to 90 student employees that we have.
And then I just want to say one thing here. Recording the presentation for these was really helpful, I think, and is something that I would do again in non-pandemic times. It really allows people the opportunity to view it at a date and time that really works for them, I think. So offering that was good.
So
Another messy page.
Everybody's feedback. I
know this is really tiny and you can't really read it, but we just thought you might want to see what bringing it all together sort of looked like. So I worked with another faculty member on the strategic planning committee, and she and I took language that had been written by 8 different people with 8 different voices and tried to create at least a more cohesive voice for the document. We also looked at things like beyond word choice, how everything was organized, what meanings were there. And then also for some of it, the reality of whether or not we actually could meet an objective, and so whether or not it should be included. Very specifically, I remember having a conversation with the other member and with Jennifer about there was an objective to, I think it was something like ensure the well-being of faculty and staff in the libraries. And while we want to have a positive working environment and we want to be inclusive, we can't really ensure someone's well-being because there are lots of factors that affect people's well-being that are outside of work. And so we had to take the, I think, underlying idea of that and make it possible to be in a work environment. So that's what the messy document ended up looking like. And then so that you could actually read some of the changes, these were sorts of things that we did. So from feedback on the early draft, it says develop resources and programming. during feedback, people pointed out that we already did some of this work. We already have an OER committee, and we have OER grant money that we're allocating. So it's not that we don't have any programs, but we would like to expand those programs. So this was a place where the feedback was really important in better representing what we actually want to be doing. The same was true for maximizing our features. That allowed us to maybe give people who are reading this, who aren't familiar with what digital UNC is, the opportunity to know that, oh, that's maybe where I can put my research and whatnot. So in the end, we came up with 4 planning priorities. As you'll remember, we originally had 5 areas, and we actually ended up having to combine a couple of them. So we tried to make sure that there were priorities that encompass the work of all people who work in the libraries. So they're fairly broad, focusing on teaching and holistic programming, focusing on our collections and how that can support research and teaching. Very important was to focus on our libraries employees. I think a lot of the strategic plans that had been done prior were very external focused, and it was really important to us to have at least one area where we were focusing on our internal employees and how we can better meet their needs and, you know, encourage them to be active members of both the libraries community and the UNC community. And then finally, we really need to look at our spaces. We have a building that was built in 1971, probably not unlike many of you. And it's been renovated in a piecemeal fashion, but not holistically. So really, it's been a priority for Jennifer and I, and then the rest of the committee, to really have something to say. We really have to focus on how we can develop our space.
And I just want to take 1 minute and say that all the verbs we used here were very deliberate choices. So foster, strengthen, develop, and transform. If you do this process, you will be amazed, and or some other term for the amount of time you spend talking about word choices and language. But it really makes a difference.
And I will say we can
Also share this out somehow. We actually have a document that we found online, so you all could find it because you're librarians, that has like active verbs that you can choose from. So it was really helpful when you kept using the word foster over and over again to be able to go out and say, oh, maybe instead it should be this word.
So I'm not going to focus
too much on the content of this, although you're welcome to read what our ideas were for transforming learning spaces. But what we really wanted you to notice was sort of how we organized it. So we started out with priorities as our top level idea of what we wanted it to be. And then we have different goals underneath those, which are a little more specific. And then it's those objectives that are really where we're going to be using folks from the libraries, faculty, staff, students, getting some input from people outside of the libraries about how we can actually achieve those goals that are under that priority. We tried to be as specific as possible. I know Sarah really wanted us to use the SMART model. Sometimes we couldn't achieve all of the letters in there, but we tried to make them achievable, specific, but also they're not as maybe time bound as some goals might be. I mean, they're within that 3-year, but we didn't say this has to be done by this point in time.
Yeah, and I just want to take a minute. Shelley asked a question earlier on about how to not just have it be the same plan said differently each time. And because of some of my past experience with doing this, I would just say a couple things. That 3-year time frame really makes a difference to get things really specific to those objectives. And then also it does help to think about what are maybe 1 or 2 things currently getting off the ground that can be incorporated into this, so that you're pre-planting some success. So there were, you know, we were already looking at how we can use our gallery space differently here. So there's an objective in here that's related to that. So there's ways to sort of link that up, which I think is really helpful and might sort of help not, you know, just saying the same things all the time. So now, so this was all done. We got all of our feedback. So then how are we implementing it? And this is something that is really important to me. A couple of years ago, I actually, with a colleague, did one of these sessions on how we implemented our plan. So that video is actually on YouTube, and I can always talk more about that if you have questions. But our libraries leadership group, which is all the department heads in the libraries, along with our communication HR specialist and Jayne and I, are the ones leading the implementation of the plan. So next to every objective is at least one LLG member's name. So they're not necessarily the one that's going to do it, but they're going to oversee, or most importantly, report back on the progress of how we are achieving that goal objective. I also made it clear that everyone in the libraries is involved in us being successful, because there was a bit of, well, the administration is going to do this. And while people might think of the administration maybe as me or Jayne and I or the other members of our administrative team, we're actually not the ones that are going out and doing all of this work. So I reiterated multiple times that this is an us process to accomplish. Within LLG, we also assigned start dates to each objective, because there was a little bit like, oh my God, now this is really overwhelming. How are we going to achieve all of this? And partly it's because we're not doing it all right now. So how can we stage it in ways that make sense? And what objectives might need to be accomplished first before we move on to something else? We do quarterly update meetings, and we have a spreadsheet where we track our progress. And then I turn those quarterly updates into a presentation for an all hands meeting, so that people every quarter get that update on where we are with accomplishing it. So here's an example of what our spreadsheet looks like. Again, just using the priority 4 goal 2 objectives. So you'll see the objectives, the lead from the leadership group, the start date, and those times are a little flexible depending on other things that are happening. And then each quarter when we update it, we do put in comments as well. So I just did a quick condensing of some of those comments from our most recent updates. So some of our lessons learned. For the most part, I would say that translating activities to a virtual environment actually worked really well. And there are 2 libraries at UNC. So we have the main library and then our music library. So I think in a lot of other contexts where there's multiple branch libraries, you want multiple people to participate that might be in different geographic locations, you probably could do the majority of this process through a Zoom or Teams or some other kind of avenue. Jayne.
Yeah, I was going to say kind of the same thing. I think it's, I think especially our faculty and student involvement was more robust and continuous because we did it virtually. The student, she often Zoomed in or teamed in from her bedroom. And then our faculty member is in a building that is about a 20-minute walk away from the library. Knowing her and her schedule, it would have probably been hard for her to carve out yet another like 40 minutes from her day to participate. But because we were online, she was able to participate with us. She did come to our lunch that we had at the very end. So I do know she can come over to the library, and she's an active library user, but it was just really nice to be able to say, you don't have to take that extra 40 minutes, but you can really participate actively. I think also, you know, having the surveys and, like Jennifer said, the recorded presentation that people could refer back to really allowed us to get a lot more information. we have some issues on our campus of having involvement when we do in-person focus groups. So, and I think that was reflected even in our virtual focus groups, but people seem to be very willing to take the time to answer a handful of survey questions to give us that feedback. So I think it's really critical to have both of those in person, even if they're virtual, but then survey types of responses available.
And I'll say too that when I did this pre-pandemic, the before times at a different institution, those open forums I had for staff, library staff feedback, as well as students and faculty, was done in person. And while I think those went really well, what I learned from this, the surveys can be anonymous. And while most people don't mind sharing their thoughts or comments in an in-person setting, there are others who may have questions or thoughts that they don't want to share in that format. And I think that that's why, again, that survey is something that I would take with me and really implement. And then I'll just say a general reflection of, I mean, we all know 2020 was horrible. It was a nightmare year that has kind of continued. We were just talking before this started. It's hard to believe it's been 2 years. And then in the midst of all of this, actually in the fall of 2020, I had 2 separate accidents where I broke both of my wrists. So I was really laid up. I didn't have a car. I couldn't drive. And for me to be able to continue to participate while I was recovering was great. But that's also where having Sarah as our facilitator and then Jayne as well, you know, there was a meeting that I wasn't able to come to. And I'm like, that process is going to continue and it's okay that I'm not there.
And I think we didn't put this on
Here as text, but I think and maybe we're going to talk about this in the next slide, I can't quite remember. I think the other really great thing about doing it oddly during a pandemic was it actually gave us a chance to focus on the future. You know, we were dealing, as all of us were, with like constantly changing rules, trying to get things online, trying to get laptops out to students because they didn't have them for taking their online classes, and doing all of these things very quickly, and sometimes having to change because now the rules are different about something. To be able to take 2 hours and maybe a little bit more time when you were working in your small groups to think about where you wanted the libraries to go, what we were doing well, how we could enhance those things. It was really kind of joyful to be able to do that. I know Cynthia was asking, how do you make this fun? And I don't know that it was necessary. It's not always fun, but it was, at least it was really rewarding, and like I said, kind of joyful to think about how we could do things differently, where we needed to grow, and not have to be thinking about, okay, I have 75 students who need computers and I only have 50 of them. What are we going to do? It was just really a nice break.
And then just a couple of takeaways before we answer more questions from everyone. I think for a lot of us, that sense of urgency is still existing. But think about, if someone asks you, why are you doing this now? What would your answer be? Is it new leadership? Is it a financial situation? Is it a lot of staffing changes? Really explaining that helps people understand that, you know, it's not just some random process that you've decided to start right now. Be really thoughtful about putting your team together. I had a couple people ask me why I didn't ask for why I didn't open it up like more broadly for people to express their interest in serving on the task force. And I did get input from like our leadership team, asking for suggestions. But because I was so new, I hadn't met a lot of these people in person yet. It was a combination of me thinking about the qualities I was looking for and, you know, what I was hearing from others, to be really deliberate about putting that team together. And then developing that shared vision. I think missions are great. They tell you why you exist, which in many cases seems very obvious. but that vision is really that distant future, that then is that guiding principle behind everything. And what are we all really working towards? And then how does that help structure everything else? And then the communication and the feedback. Both Jayne and I have talked a lot about the different ways that we got that. It's really invaluable. For people that then aren't on the task force, they constantly want to know, like, what's going on? What are you talking about? This isn't secretive. So, we shared about our process and examples and how we came up with things. And hopefully people took away from that, that we really, we did make changes based off of comments and feedback that we received. Jayne, anything else on that?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, Jayne put in links in the chat to our mission, vision, values, and to the plan that we put together. Here's our emails. We're always happy to follow up. But we have a little bit of time left, and there's a couple specific questions. So I saw Kathy had a question about our spaces part. So Jayne, I don't know if you want to take that.
I'd love to. And my
Cat has decided to make an appearance. So if you see a little black head, that's my cat.
Byron.
The many things that we all learned about each other from doing lots of Zoom stuff. The question is, did we have funding secured to allow for the goal setting of modernizing and adapting our space? And the answer is yes, sort of. So we have money set aside. We are the James A. Michener Library. James Michener gave us a decent endowment, so we have some foundation funds that we can use. So we knew we had money to hire an architect to help us make what I like to call pretty pictures that we can then take out to try to do some capital fundraising to actually do a major renovation. So we're very lucky that we have foundation funds set aside so that we can hire an architect. And we actually just met with them yesterday, and we're making a plan for them to come visit in the fall. So it'll be used then to create more proposals for more funding.
Yeah. And then Laura wondered what the biggest surprise was that we heard or learned, in some of our information gathering, and any surprise in terms of the process. I'll say that the biggest surprise for me was people's reaction to our initial draft vision statement. It was really negative, not really negative. There was just a lot of confusion, like, this doesn't speak to me. I really don't agree with this. And it was so important. I mean, we went back and we really did a strong rewriting and then ran it by a few people before we took it out again. But we needed to hear that, because if that doesn't resonate, the whole thing's not going to work. So that was maybe my biggest surprise / kind of disappointment initially that worked out well. Jayne?
I don't know that it was necessarily a surprise to know that people think about
Processes differently. But I think one of the things that we're doing is we've also done a reorganization to better align some of our work with departments and to be a little more clear about what certain departments do. And there was a little bit of pushback about, why are we doing a reorganization after we've done the strategic plan? Why didn't we do that before? And so just how people think about processes differently. I always appreciate that they're willing to share that information. And yet it's also, I'm always like, oh, well, that's very different than how I was thinking of it. So. Yeah,
and I think sometimes the level of concrete detail that some people, need for certain things, but yeah, we're getting there. Everybody works different. Let's see. So I'm just going to quickly go back up to the top just to see if there's any final questions. But please, oh yes, Marini, right?
Yeah, you got it right. So. Hi, a quick question. So I'm really curious. One of the things you talked about was having your everybody being the plan reflecting the work of everybody, or not reflecting the work, but incorporating everybody's work. And I think like that's one of the tensions I've seen is between that operational foundational work and strategic work. And I'm curious, now that you're kind of living with the plan a little bit more, how, like, is that actually playing out? Because obviously the strategic plan cannot touch every single facet of every job that exists. I'm curious how, now that you're living into the plan a little bit, how is that playing out with people remaining engaged and seeing and not constantly, but looking towards this strategic plan and referencing it and it being a living document rather than a thing that we've archived on our website or put up on a shelf or something like that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So our faculty librarians here do yearly work plans. And so I know that's one thing the department heads are having conversations with the faculty in terms of where's the intersection between different objectives and the work that they're doing and how that is within certain departments. And I can have Jayne talk a little bit more about some of it, but the other part for me is that it is a living document. So we have a quarterly update coming up in May, but then our one after that, we're going to take a quick step back and reassess, are some of the objectives worded the way we need them now? Are there things maybe that because of some leadership changes, some staffing changes that we've had, do we just take those off? Is there something else maybe that we should add? So to me, the plan gets updated even while it's in the course of being implemented to more accurately reflect what's going on. Because, and this is what I found when I did my first plan, which was 5 years, we got like 1.5 years or 2 years into it. And it was like, oh, that thing we thought we were going to do, there's no way we're doing that. Jayne, other thoughts?
I think also we made the
Priority statements broad enough that like all of the units, at least at a high level, are reflected. So that helps, I think, people at least say, oh, I work in technical services. I see that collections is part of that. That at least is some of my work. And then the other thing is that one of the priorities is about employee engagement. And so we have some small working groups that are helping develop, we have a group that's working on how areas we need to grow and develop for making more inclusive recruitment and retention. And those are going to be then, this is not making everybody really happy, more working groups will be created. But trying to keep them small and really focused. And then the other part is the building renovation has allowed everybody to have an opportunity to give some feedback on that. We actually dedicated one of our all hands meetings to people saying, draw us a map of what you think each floor of the building should look like. Here are pictures of office furniture. What do you love about that? So having some things that are also, I think, broader has allowed people to continue to feel engaged.
Yeah, and there was a question earlier too about, I don't know, how to sustain library staff engagement when everyone is exhausted. We were also exhausted, I have to say, and still am. And so I think it's sort of a mix. And one thing that I know sometimes I need some help with is pausing and recognizing and celebrating when something has been accomplished. So trying to build in those moments that it's not just the constant go, 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 or it's not always new. But, so that's why when the strategic plan was finished, the group was able to come together in person and have a lunch. And that was really nice. That was the first time I saw that faculty member in person. So what are those kind of break moments where you're still moving forward, but hopefully at least hitting a bit of a pause to celebrate in whatever way you find best. So we also internally have a group that we call the M&Ms, and they plan more of the fun activities and like social events. So they had Oscars Madness that happened recently. They did a historical tour of campus. So there's also, it's nice that that was pre-built into the culture. So that helps.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jennifer and Jayne, and for joining us today in our presentation. I hope you found it useful and of course, reach out to them if you have any questions about strategic planning in academic libraries. And I hope you have all a wonderful day.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thanks, Rusty.
Mhm.